Welcome Chess Club. I'm happy to be doing my second video for you. I hope you're enjoying them and using them at your leisure at home. Some of these videos are going to be a little bit of review because you haven't done chess in a while. As you recall, we were talking about forks last time and pins. Today I'm going to review a little bit of forks and then move into showing how the pin can be used in a game. So we'll talk about forks in a game and then pins in a game. Remember, you can always call me if you have any questions at all with the puzzle sheets that I'm sending you or about this lesson. Now, you remember when we talked about forks, we talked about the fried liver attack. The fried liver attack is an attack on Foolish Freddy, the weak pawn, where the white knight gets to f7, forking the queen and the rook. In a game, it looks like this. e4, e5, the two pawns meeting in the center, good for white, good for black, because they are both controlling the center, which you want to do, and also releasing avenues for the queens and the bishops. White comes out with the knight attacking the center pawn. Black comes out defending the center pawn. Now, usually white will bring out their bishop here in the fried liver attack. White can do a lot of different things. We're just taking certain paths through these games. Now we have the bishop attacking the weak pawn. The correct move for black usually is this. Two knights, both players controlling the center with the center pawn, bringing out knights and bishops. These are things you want to do in the opening of a chess game. Now, if white moves their knight again in the opening, which is breaking some of the guidelines. Generally in the opening of a chess game, you do not want to move the same piece twice, but if they do, they bring the knight here to g5, black should be asking themselves, where is that knight going? And where that knight is going is to f7. If the knight gets there, protected by the bishop, the knight will be forking the rook and the queen. Okay? Now, as we have done in Chess Club, we know that that is a fork that's important for black to find a path through so they don't get checkmated. The correct move for black usually is to block with this pawn. That way, the bishop is not attacking the weak pawn. And if the knight goes here, the bishop is not protecting. So white will often take that pawn. Now, as we've shown you before, if black takes, and if the knight takes anyway, and then the king takes, and the queen comes and says, check, things could go very poorly for black. We've done this in Chess Club. So I want to show you a different way black can get out of this difficult predicament. So let me backtrack for a minute. We're going to backtrack just a little bit. We're going to take the knight back to here. We're going to move the knight. Queen goes back. Knight goes back to here. We're just going to take it back to the beginning where we were before. Okay? I'm missing a pawn. Here it is. So, e4, e5. Knight comes out. Knight defends. Bishop comes out. Knight comes out. The knight moves twice in the opening. Bells go off in your head. Ding, 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 ding. They're going to try the fried liver. Black comes here. White takes. Now notice when white is taking, they're also attacking this knight. The path forward here is not to retake with this knight. There are two good paths forward. One is to bring your knight here so the pawn can't capture to attack the bishop. But the one we're going to look at today is where the knight comes here. Okay? So the knight comes here to d4. White still wants this fork. They really, really want it. So they move here. And black says, fine. My queen is going to come out and take that pawn. And black says, well, you know what? With the queen on that square, I can fork the queen and the rook anyway. So the knight comes and forks. And the knight is forking one piece, attacking the rook and the queen. It's a double attack by one piece. That's why we call it a fork. So black says, I don't want to lose my queen. So they move here. And white is thinking, well, you might get my bishop, but I get the rook. The rook is worth 5 points. The bishop's only worth 3. So white takes the rook. But sometimes what white fails to see is that black also has a fork. The queen is not just attacking the bishop. The queen is also attacking this pawn. So watch what happens. If the queen comes down and takes this pawn, she's now attacking the rook. And this rook goes here, the queen will take. So the rook oftentimes, now remember in this game, white and black both have lots of choices. I'm just showing you one variation of all the choices. And I encourage you to explore all the different variations yourself, because it's quite fun to look at. So let's say that white goes here. That's a natural move for white, because white doesn't want to lose their rook, and here the rook is protected by the king and by the bishop. So the queen comes here and says, check. Check is a powerful tool. Now, if the queen blocks, because the king can't move out of check, and we can't capture the checking piece, so the only option to white is to block. They have 2 pieces to block with. They could block with the queen, and then the knight gets the queen. Good for black. Or they could block with the bishop. So white says, fine, I'll block with the bishop. And then you know what happens? Now the bishop is pinned. Remember, we talked about that last time. A pin means that this piece can't move. This is not a relative. This is an absolute pin. This bishop absolutely cannot move. Because if this bishop moves now, that's moving into check, and you're not allowed to. So what black does is black comes here and says, checkmate. So white had this great attack with this fork, but black turned the tables on white and was able to checkmate the king. We call this a smothered checkmate because the king feels protected by all of his pieces, but he can't move. And if the king can't move, a really good checkmater is the knight, because the knight cannot be blocked. So now I'm going to pause for a second and then show you a different game using the pins. Okay, we are back now. I reset the board. Didn't want you guys to have to wait for that. Now I'm going to re-show a game that I showed all of you before the December break. And you might remember the story of Paul Morphy, the very first U.S. chess champion. He was a child chess prodigy, very good. Some people say one of the best players in the history of chess. This is one of his most famous games. You've seen it before, The Night at the Opera. The reason I'm re-showing it today is because now that you know more about pins and have played more chess, I think you can appreciate better what Paul Morphy does in this most fabulous game. Now, as you know, Paul Morphy was white. The Duke and the Count were black. Paul Morphy played e4, and the Duke and the Count played e5. Now, I want to remind you that I sent you out a sheet about chess notation. I'm hoping you guys will look at it, because that's how I'm looking at this game that was played in 1858, because Paul Morphy wrote it down, and using that notation, we can see what he played. Paul Morphy, like all good players, moved knight f3 to attack this pawn, developing his knights and bishops, which is what you want to do. And the Duke and the Count moved this pawn up. This is another way to protect the center pawn, and it releases the bishop, but it's going to block this bishop. And what you're going to see in this game is how Paul Morphy is going to control the board and squeeze down black's pieces, so black will not have very many opportunities to move, or many options to move. Now, Paul Morphy loves getting the 2-pawn center. He moves this pawn up here So they has two pawns controlling the center. This bishop has this diagonal. This bishop has this diagonal. It's a very strong position for white already on move 3. Now we know when the Duke and the Count move this pawn here, even though they blocked this bishop, it allows this bishop to come out. This bishop comes out and pins the knight to the queen. That's a relative pin. This knight can move, not a good idea to move, because it means that the bishop would be able to catch the queen. So white takes this pawn, and what you're going to see is black is going to take this knight. Now, when you pin a piece, you don't have to take the piece. What a pin does is it works well to stop a piece from moving. You recall last time I took this clown and I pinned it to the wall because pins can stop things from moving? Well, that's what a pin does. But the Duke and the Count, instead of just leaving this pin and allowing that and making that knight be there, not able to move, they go ahead and they take this knight. And what that does is it allows Paul Morphy to develop his queen with tempo, making it so that the queen comes out, takes the bishop. So he gets to both develop the queen, take the bishop, and now the queen is attacking the weak pawn. Queen takes. Now the Duke and the Count take this pawn here, and Paul Morphy brings his bishop out. And already on the 6th move, Paul Morphy is threatening checkmate in 1. Because if the queen comes up here and takes the weak pawn, right there, protected by the bishop, that is checkmate. But the Duke and the Count are pretty good, so they don't let that happen. Queen comes back. Okay, so Paul Morphy is threatening checkmate, but it's black's turn. Duke and the Count block it by bringing out the knight. So now the queen can't get to Foolish Freddy, can't get to the weak pawn this way, so she comes all the way over here. And now, again, you have a double attack, the bishop and the queen on the weak pawn. On move 7, Paul Morphy is threatening checkmate in 2 moves. Because if the bishop comes here and says check, the king can only move here or here. Let's say he moves here, and that's checkmate. The queen is the checkmater, the bishop is the helper. The queen and the bishop protect one another. Okay? If the king moves here, well, that's still checkmate. So Paul Morphy is threatening checkmate in 2 moves from this position right here. Duke and the Count don't want that to happen. So they move their queen out to protect the weak pawn. Okay? So the pawn is, and now Paul Morphy brings out his knight. Because one of the things you want to do before you come into a full attack is get all your team players out. So right now, Paul Morphy has a bishop, queen, and knight all getting ready to attack. Pawn controlling the center. And this bishop is not out yet. It will come out in a minute. But it still has control over that diagonal. So the knight comes out. And notice that when the queen moved here, she's not just attacking down here, she's also attacking this pawn. If the queen takes that pawn, because this knight is blocking the rook, the queen will also get that rook. So the Duke and the Count move a pawn up, so the queen is now really working hard. She's protecting this pawn, and she's protecting this pawn. Now I want you to notice something already. Paul Morphy has all these pieces out, and the Duke and the Count, this bishop is blocked, this rook is blocked, this knight is now blocked, can't come out here. This rook only has 1 square to move, so they can't do a whole lot. And on his next move, Paul Morphy brings out his bishop and pins the knight. And now this knight can't move. This is a relative pin. Again, this knight can move by the rules of chess, but it would be a bad idea because then the bishop would take. So this rook can't move, except for one square. This bishop can't move. Now the knight can't move, and this rook can't move. Hardly any of the pieces that the Duke and the Count have can move. So the Duke and the Count are going to try to attack down here, so they move here. This is when the fireworks begin. So this pawn is attacking. The knight takes the pawn. The pawn takes the knight, and the bishop takes the pawn and says check. And the knight comes and blocks. And now the knight is pinned. So let's review for a second. This is an absolute pin. This knight absolutely cannot move because that would be moving it to check. This pin is a relative pin. So you have Paul Morphy using both pins, an absolute pin and a relative pin. And, you know, he's not just going to take these pieces. Remember when I talked to you last time about pins? When you pin a piece, you want to attack the pinned piece. And so Paul Morphy does this great move, and he castles queenside. 1, 2, Scooby-Doo. And now the rook is attacking the pinned piece. This rook is attacking the knight. That is pinned. The bishop doesn't just take, but he attacks it a second time. So, here we go. The bishop can't move. This knight is pinned. This rook only has one square. This knight is absolutely pinned. The queen is still protecting down here and blocking the bishop. The only piece that can move right now is this rook. Pawns can move, they're not pieces. So this rook comes over here to try to protect the knight. And the rook takes the knight. And now the rook takes the rook. And now that one rook that could move is pinned. Absolutely pinned. Do you see how Paul Morphy's pieces are able to move throughout the board? But this rook is pinned, this knight is pinned, this bishop is blocked, this rook only has one teeny tiny square he can move to. Black has very few options, okay? So now, when you pin a piece, the bishop doesn't just take. You attack the pinned piece. This rook now attacks this rook. And now the Duke and the Count are in kind of dire straits, but they must unpin the knight. So they move the queen up to e6 so that the knight can protect the rook. So now the bishop takes and says check. And now the knight moves and takes the bishop. And the queen comes down and says check to the king. And as I said to you before, the Duke and the Count are so excited because Paul Morphy is checking, but the knight can take the queen. And they're so happy. We got Paul Morphy's queen. They can't believe it. Paul Morphy, the best player at the time, and they just took his queen. And Paul Morphy says, I want to go back to watching the opera. And he brings his rook down and says, checkmate. And that, my friends, is such a beautiful game. And I want you to remember that what Paul Morphy did was he didn't just use pins to capture pieces, although he did capture them, but he was using pins to prevent his opponent from moving those pieces, even while they were still on the board. So practice using pins, practice going through this game. A lot of players in tournaments play almost this exact game and win because they remember how Paul Morphy, the first U.S. champion, used pins in his chess game. See you all next week.